Resilience is about just keeping going and just against all the costs, again, just keep going. And what I've come to learn from really looking at resilience, it's not that at all. Sometimes resilience is about saying, actually, I'm not doing that. Looking back, the reason why I was so unwell is because I stayed in crisis, which I quite liked. I think I'm at my best when I'm in a crisis or in a challenge, but I just stayed there the whole time. And you can't. One of the things I believe, well, I really do believe a characteristic of a resilient person is humour. That enabled me to build some relationships with some really tricky characters. It takes time and it takes energy to actually really hold that mirror up to yourself and think, okay, so what am I going to do differently? People say, oh, I haven't got time to do that. Well, then fair enough. That's your choice. You can do something about it.
Hey, welcome to the Leaders Podcast with me, Laura MacDonald, the leadership coach and mentor. Come with me as I explore the elements of leadership that give leaders like you the power and confidence to make the impact you know you can. I'll be sharing my own experiences, top tips and insights, and talking to some very special guests to share their thoughts and leadership experiences on mindset, influence, change, and growth. So let's get right to it. For today's episode, I'm welcoming the brilliantly engaging Jacqui Frost, ACC accredited ICF coach, former head teacher, resilient leaders consultant, and director of Leadership 43. Welcome to the Leaders Podcast, Jacqui.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, Laura.
No problem at all. Before we get going on pouring out all that insightful wisdom out of your head, I have a question to ask you.
Okay.
So, great leaders know that it's about serving others, right? And to serve others well, you have to serve yourself too. And everyone has different ways of doing this. So let's get some ideas out there, is my mission at the moment. So my question to you is, what have you done to serve yourself in the last 24 hours?
Oh, now that's interesting, because if you'd said, what did I do 24 years ago, so it'd be very, very different to what I've done this 24 hours. So in this last 24 hours, I have read a book, just 5-10 minutes. I walked the dog twice. What else have I done? I have had a conversation with a friend and made some plans for January. So all the things, if I just thinking back, I've drank my 2 litres of water. I know that that's a really big thing for me. For me, just reflecting back, it's all been short, sharp things. Short, sharp, immediate things, which I can't make an excuse for not doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I totally know what you mean. It's the little things, isn't it, that often
Yeah.
serve ourselves the best. What book did you read out of interest?
Well, I'm rereading Susan Scott's Fierce Conversations.
Oh, okay.
So it's I do some work with clients, with workshop, all different people around having it's about having difficult conversations, but it's about having conversations with clarity. And I find her ideas and her some of her thinking really helpful.
Is it all stuff that helps you to work with other people, or is there stuff that helps you too?
I think actually there's it's twofold. Yes, it helps me to support other people in planning conversations that they might have or want to have. But what it will do as well is it helps me communicate with greater clarity. I can be a waffler. Can't we
Is that a
all?
bad thing? Aren't we
Well, I
all?
don't know.
Waffling's good sometimes. I think sometimes you just want to. I think waffling comes from passion. I think
Yeah, I
waffling
think
comes
it
from when you're
does.
really dedicated to something or dedicated to a thought. So I don't always see
But
waffling
I
as a bad
think
thing.
what I have learned over the past sort of since I left headship was actually is it's about that clarity in your communication. Like, is this person understanding what I am trying to communicate, or do I just think they have, or have they understood it but in a totally different way? Yeah,
Yeah.
because sometimes waffling, I find, helps you work out a thought process or enables you to process something.
I think it's good to always work on your communication anyway. I think of all the communication skills that we all have, I always say listening is the most powerful tool. But I think you do have to work on the others, and clarity is definitely one of them. Well, I've spent a fair bit of time with you in the last couple of years
Yeah.
with various things, one-to-one in group settings, and met you in person as well, which has been lovely. And I know a bit about your story, but I'm interested to hear a bit more about it. So, what got you to this place in your life?
Oh dear. So I did the traditional, went to university, then I got my first teaching job, and then I started teaching in a junior school in Clacton, and I rose up through the ranks quite quickly. I got my first headship in 2001 in a small village school in Suffolk. So I was actually a teaching head, which is a mind-blowing experience. Then I went on to subsequent headships there, interspersed with doing a little bit of advisory work. I then, as a head teacher, and I took over a failing closing middle school in Lowestoft. Lowestoft feels a little bit like the end of the world, really. No one really goes to Lowestoft. Got the most amazing beaches, fabulous beaches. And I did my bit for Queen and Country there. The school was closing, so I said to the local authority, if you keep me here and then just find me a job for the term, then I'll stay right to the end. They said they couldn't do that, so I had to go off and find a job. So I then got a headship of a three form, which was going to four form entry primary school in Ipswich, in quite a socially deprived area for Suffolk. I stayed there, and that's when, shall we say, overwhelm got the better of me. It started quite slowly. I've always been someone who's worked really, really hard, but reflecting back, because it was such a challenging school, what I found myself doing was just working longer and harder. So I was feeling overwhelmed, not keeping on top of things. So I was just working longer and harder. My relationship with my husband, with my son suffered, but I just ploughed on. And then it was, I think it was 2012, yeah. I went on a walking holiday with a friend in the October half term. I came back and I went to work on the Monday, and I started with what I thought was a cold. And I just carried on working. And then it got to the March, and I remember sitting in my office. I'd been back to the doctors, got antibiotics, I'd got all these sort of things, and I didn't have very many days off work because in my mind it was just a cold. And then it was in the March, I remember being sat in my office. So this is March 2013, thinking, oh my God, I feel really, really ill. So ill, I had to ask my husband to come and collect me, which was unheard of in my life. I just felt I couldn't drive. And he just took me straight to the doctors and said, basically said, I've had enough of this. And the first test they wanted to do was for leukemia. And I was a bit,
Wow.
ooh. Anyway, fortunately, I didn't have leukemia, but I did have something wrong with my immune system. And the level of infection in my body was just ridiculously high. And what was happening is I'd start to feel a little bit better, and then I'd catch something else because you're in a primary school. And then that would just be like another layer on it. So I was signed off work for, I think she signed me off for something like ridiculous, like 6 weeks, which made me feel really, really uncomfortable and agitated. It wasn't a very nice time. My deputy head was brilliant, and he did a brilliant job and just let me know on a Friday anything I needed to know. So I went back to work, and I promised my husband I would change my working habits. But when something is at your very core and you are driven by your own values and purpose, I probably did it for about 3 weeks, and then I just slipped into my old habits. So it was the beginning of 2016, and I just thought, I'm just going to have to resign. I can't do this anymore. So I resigned with no job to go to, which was incredibly scary. I then picked up some work with the Suffolk Primary Heads Association supporting head teachers. And then that sort of fired my interest in actually coaching in a more structured way, because I wanted to provide more for the head teachers rather than just swapping war stories, because I tended to go into schools that were in crisis. That was 16 hours a week. And then I just did everything that people asked me to do, even things I didn't want to do. But I needed to earn money. And then I went into partnership with two other colleagues, and that's how Leadership 43 was born, because we're at point of conception, shall we say, we had 43 years of combined leadership. I was also an Ofsted inspector, but I hated that as well. So I stopped, that ceased. And then I just really concentrated on coaching, one-to-one team coaching, leadership development as part of my Resilient Leaders Consultant. It's sort of like more tools to my toolkit. And yeah, I find myself in a position now. So it will be, my maths is rubbish. Is it 8 years? I'll be going into my 9th year. And I feel really at peace with where I am now. I coach a lot of school leaders, and I find that sometimes quite distressing, because I just think, what are we doing to these people? But yeah, I feel like I'm making a difference, but in a different way. You know, I'm not at the helm of a school, but I can support and guide people in a different way, because it doesn't have to be like the path I was on.
You know what? I so resonate with that, because hospitality was exactly the same. It was work everybody into the ground. Working hard meant being there 24 hours a day. It was just endless. Just no amount of sales, no amount of efficiency, no amount of productivity, no amount of tasks ticked off a list was ever going to be enough. It just pushed and pushed and pushed people to their very limits. And it's some of us ex colleagues from one particular company have a running joke that nobody ever really left quietly from that company. It always ended with a bang.
I think as well, when I reflect back, Laura, I do also think that some of the pressure and the expectations came from within me, because I think, reflecting back, that actually, like ploughing on when I had a cold, if I'd have said, actually, I'm really ill in November, I'm taking 2 weeks off, I might have recovered. But for me, it seemed like a perceived weakness as a leader. Oh, you can't be off, you've only got a flipping cold. So some of that pressure and those expectations was certainly generated by me.
That was the most curious thing I found, was that actually when I really thought about it, no one had told me to do 100 hours a week.
No. Oh, exactly. No. And I know some head teachers who actually operated in a significantly healthier way than I did. And they were just like, well, if it's not done, it's not done.
I've got two family members. One's a retired deputy head and the other one is a teacher. And they both say, I mean, to be fair, I think they both managed a lot better than some of the other teachers that I've seen. But they still felt enormous pressure. There was still a lot of demands placed on their time, and some of that came from their own head and some of that was just the way of working. It was that old thing of, oh, you know, we don't do this for the money, we do it to support children through their education.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier on about that being in service, and that's a really good thing to hide behind. You know, well, I'm doing this for everybody else. It's a really selfless act. I'm doing this for everybody else, so I'm bottom of the list. And I did that as well.
Now you speak so much about resilience, and most of your work is dedicated to resilience. So why is resilience important enough to you that you've made it the primary word in your business, in your work?
Yeah, well, for me, I thought I was being resilient, going back, and if I look back through my career, when my son he was going to be 3 in October 97, and in the August of 97, his dad, my ex-husband, had a massive brain hemorrhage in my parents' back garden and was in Addenbrooke's in intensive care for months and months. And then he went to rehabilitation and he survived. And when I look back, if I'm really, really honest with myself, I threw myself into my work because my husband was in hospital, Callum was being cared for. I did have time off, of course I did. But actually, I thought then resilience was just picking yourself up and you keep on going, that sort of, we'll fight them on the beaches, British, that real sort of, I'm just going to keep on going. I think that then actually followed me all the way through my career. Resilience is about just keeping going and just against all the costs, again, just keep going. And what I've come to learn from really looking at resilience, it's not that at all. It's really, really not that at all. Sometimes resilience is about saying, actually, I'm not doing that. Or turning to the person on your left and saying, you're a lot better at doing that than me. I'll do this for you, but I'm going to create the space, the time, whatever, for you to do this. And for me, resilience is about bringing all your learnings from the good, the bad, and the ugly of life, and bringing it all to the front of your mind and thinking, this didn't work the way I did it this time. So what would I do next time? And actually carving out time for you to rehearse and practice it in quieter times of life, not when you're actually in that crisis, in that period of challenge or chaos, whatever, but actually really thinking about what would I do and say, what would I do differently? And for me, resilience is about how individuals and teams navigate a spectrum from calm, relative calm, through from uncertainty, challenge, crisis, and chaos. And because resilience is about, it isn't about saying, well, I'm never going to be in chaos. That's just rubbish. And you're kidding yourself. It's about, okay, so when I'm in there, what am I going to be doing and saying? And also when that thing has finished, how am I going to rebalance? Because looking back, the reason why I was so unwell is because I stayed in crisis. I rode that wave, which I quite liked. I do quite like that. I think I'm at my best when I'm in a crisis or in a challenge, but I just stayed there the whole time. And you can't, because when you do come down, oh boy, you come down with an absolute crash. So for me, resilience is about a heightened sense of self-awareness and a self-knowing about how you respond to different things. And you and I would be very different. What might send you into a dizzy spin, I'd be like, oh, Laura, that's fine. But actually, what might actually send me riding that wave, you'd be like, Jacqui, why, So it's really individual. That's what makes it so hard. And I think people ban the word resilience around, and there's sort of an element of fatigue around it. Oh, here we go again. I've got to be, Boris told us to be more resilient, didn't he? In COVID, or thanked us for being resilient. And I just think you can, and it's not a fixed thing. You can grow and strengthen it if you really want to.
Definitely. To me, like, you've summed resilience up as needing two things. The first is reflection and learning. So being able to identify if something's not worked for you this time, like what could you do differently? What could you say differently? How could you respond, or how could you prepare differently? But the other side of that is actually being able to use your voice when you've made those decisions. And when that situation comes up again, to be able to say, no, that's not going to work for me. I need to do it this way. It is this constant process, isn't it?
I mean, I think because of the way of the world, and this comes from a fellow resilient leaders consultant, actually, she highlighted this to us, is actually all leaders need to be resilient because every industry, every setting, it's constant change, isn't it? It's or change, uncertainty. So actually, if you are going to be a leader, you need to be able to manage your own resilience and the resilience of your team.
There needs to be that
No,
quiet space together.
yeah, absolutely. There needs to be time. It's about culture as well. It's about trust. It's about being able to feel that you professionally, you can say anything, even if it creates professional conflict, because without that, you are never, ever going to find a better way. You just keep doing things the same old way because no one wants to rock the boat.
You need some sort of disagreement or
Yeah.
different
I
perspectives.
always
You
say,
need,
professional conflict is where you get growth.
yeah,
And you only get conflict where you've got you've got psychological safety, people feel safe and secure, and that people aren't going to take what they say out of context, all of those things. And it doesn't just happen.
no.
It takes a real conscious effort from not only the leader, but also anybody in a team.
I always explain conflict to people as when we hear that word, we often think of words like argument. And that's not necessarily true. To me, conflict is defined as two differing sets of expectations or perspectives. That's all it is that you've got one set of expectations about what's going to happen and I've got another. So we need to use
Yeah.
the right strategy to sort of figure out what it is that we need. Do we both need to give up something and both get something? Does one of us need to win for any reason? Does one of us need to abandon the conversation? Does somebody else need to say, let's find a way to collaborate on this so that we all
Mm.
get everything out of it? Make the
Mm.
pie bigger for everyone, as I call it.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, absolutely.
like you say, it only happens when we really put that effort and time into creating space, allowing that trust, that respect, that kind of team connection to develop so that psychological safety can be present,
Mm. Mm.
and then to create more space to allow people to voice what they think.
When I look at things like that, I use the work of Patrick Lencioni quite a lot. He looks at the 5 dysfunctions of a team, and his bedrock is trust. And the flip, if you haven't got trust, then you often have mistrust, which is actually it's very toxic because it's where people pretend to trust each other. So you might be in a team meeting, everyone's going, oh, yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, absolutely. And then they walk out and they go to maybe a colleague, what an absolute load of rubbish. I'm not doing that. So actually, that's even worse. That's the worst type of, I personally think that's the worst type of team environment to be in, where everybody pretends that they trust each other, but then as soon as your back's turned, they're undermining you, making negative comments. It's like, if you can't say it to my face, then don't say it at all.
I think the example that springs to mind for me, I walked into another team a few years ago and it didn't feel like my last team. A bit, I was curious as to what was missing because in that group of people, there just seemed to be this level of disconnect, and it was almost like everybody was just sort of living on the surface. And I couldn't work out what it was. And then one day we had a conference call online, and somebody got a phone call in the middle of that meeting, and she forgot to put herself on mute. You can imagine what I'm about to say.
We've all done that, haven't we?
Yeah,
Yeah.
she forgot to put herself on mute, and yeah, we all heard what she thought about the meeting and the contents and everything else.
Mm.
And I suddenly, yeah, I realized that was exactly it. It was this kind of surface level pretense
Mm.
of trust.
And
And
I
that's
think,
where it wasn't that we couldn't talk to each other, but that level of
yeah,
psychological safety needed to create, as you say, things like conflict to develop resilience, to build stronger trust
exactly.
wasn't
And I
there.
think people get muddled. Well, maybe muddled's maybe not the right word, but people confuse that sometimes that sort of ability to have conflict or to trust with actually everybody liking each other and actually going out to the pub on a Friday night, or whatever. And I used to say to my teams, we are all going to get on, but don't expect us to go on holiday together. This is about professional relationships, and professional relationships are very, very different to those social relationships, those people you might class as friends. And you can have a professional relationship and challenge someone, and you shouldn't be worried that they're then going to go and slag you off or or moan about you on the phone to somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite difficult. I think one of the things that I would definitely change from my hospitality career was this kind of idea that we were a family, because we spent so much time with each other. We spent more time with each other than we did with our
I'm
own
sure
friends and
you
family.
did. Yeah, yeah.
And when you work in that intense environment, a lot of your friendships come out of that anyway. So you do have a lot of friends at work,
Of course you
you
do.
actually do. But yeah, the idea of like calling us a family now, because we've done it already and because we had that experience, like I wouldn't take that away now. But if
No,
I
no,
was
no,
to start
no.
again tomorrow, that's what I would change, because I actually think it damaged our resilience in a lot of ways, because we kind of had this blurring of the lines about what we actually
Yeah.
were to each other. And
And
because of that,
that makes it really hard, Laura, I
yeah.
think.
And it
Yeah.
perpetuated, like it became this self-perpetuating thing of the working hard bit and the overworking and the burnout and everything
We're
else that
all
came
in
with
this
it.
together.
We're
That
all
kind
in
of,
this together.
yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
That's the one thing I would change, reverting that and saying, well, actually, no, we need to find another word that does accurately describe us, but doesn't compare us to a family, because a family doesn't do
yeah.
this.
And I
You know?
think as well, when in my experience, when I have certainly blurred some professional relationships. What can sometimes happen with that is that you then create quite a dependent relationship. And then when that friend, work colleague, whatever, needs something from you or needs you to ignore something or whatever that might be, then that's when the blurring of the lines becomes really, really hard.
And the dynamic shift that happens when one of those people leaves as well
Mm.
is incredibly difficult to deal with. I worked in an industry where staff turnover is typically quite high. So, but when you've got this kind of core team and we've all, risen through the ranks together, and then suddenly someone disappears,
Mm.
and it's like,
Mm.
oh, hang on a minute, who are we going to get? This person's not going to feel like family, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was quite damaging. I think it did
Yeah,
a lot
yeah,
more damage than
and
we
I would
realised.
agree with you. I think I can relate to that totally, and it shouldn't be like that.
Going back to when you were in teaching, just for a second, you've shared with me some great stories over the times about your times in schools, including finding a python in
Yeah,
the
oh yes,
school,
scary Dave
and
with a python round his neck.
yeah, and how to get the point across to another kid about what's okay to say to another kid.
Swear words in your pocket. Yeah, yeah.
Indeed. So I'm curious because I know you obviously reflect on what you've done for yourself in this area, but what do you think you did that supported the kids in your care to develop that resilience for themselves?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think, if I'm really honest, when I was a head teacher, we didn't talk about resilience with children. Now you're supposed to teach it like, any subject. But I think for looking back and how I was with children, bearing in mind I would often end up with the most challenging of the children. And I think for me, it was always about trying to break the cycles for them. And so break the cycles of patterns of behavior. So when you are feeling X, Y, and Z, is there a different thing you could say rather than that expletive to 30 other members of your class? Or is there a different thing you could do? So for me, that is about resilience, is finding different ways of managing emotions, feelings, events, people. So yeah, I would always, explore that with children. And also the other thing I always try to do with children is really to make them believe they could touch the stars. And every now and again, out of the blue, I get a message off Facebook from an ex-parent saying, oh, just to let you know, I think the one I had a while ago was, oh, just to let you know that so and so, who was a child at the school, has just got a first at Oxford. And I think we contributed to that in some way. And that is about really creating high aspirations for children whose environment possibly doesn't give them that. I spent a lot of time building relationships with kids like this and hearing swear words I'd never heard before. One of the things I believe, well, I really do believe a characteristic of a resilient person is humour. And actually, of course, I excluded children. Well, actually only ever did 2 permanent exclusions in my whole career, but I've done fixed terms exclusions. I've had really difficult conversations with parents about their children and stuff like that. But I have the thing I always try to do is find the humour in some really, really tough situations. And to be honest with you, Laura, that did bite me on the backside a few times. That did come and bite me hard when my humour had been taken out of context by staff who had, a grievance against me. But, when I think that enabled me to build some relationships with some really tricky characters.
So my ex-deputy head teacher from secondary school passed away of cancer earlier this year. And one of his students had stayed in contact with him after we all left school. And she put a massive post out there basically saying he's on his deathbed, things aren't going to last much longer. I thought what we could do is maybe start like a kind of like an online note board kind of thing,
Yeah.
from all the ex-students. And loads of people passed it round because obviously we all had like sisters. And this thing reached hundreds of people, and I was astounded because I was just like, I went onto the noteboard to read what people had been saying about what they're up to or what their kind of experience was with this teacher. And the first thing I thought, which was what a lot of people said, was, oh my God, like the girls from this school are rocking the world. Like, we are all doing amazing. Look at what we've achieved. And then obviously tagged to that was messages of praise and thanks and gratitude for this particular teacher who had had an enormous impact on us. And the key characteristic I specifically remember about him was humour. I specifically remember him being by far the funniest teacher in school. I thought he was
Yeah,
brilliant.
yeah, and actually, when I meet past students, they do say that to me. Oh, Mrs. Ross, you used to be really funny. Can you remember that time when you walked in the class with the globe in your hand, singing, I've got the whole world in my hands? And I went, well, I'm sure that wasn't me. And they went, oh, it was you. And you remember, and I actually think, but actually that enabled me to have relationships with the pupils, so that when we did have difficult conversations, I could say that's really not acceptable. I always remember I never really shouted. I only ever shouted if I needed to distract a child because they were going to hurt another child. And I always remember shouting, although I don't know, these lads have been up to no good, and I caught someone else out of my corner of my eye doing something else, and I shouted at him, and I just heard these lads behind me go, oh, you really pissed her off now. It's like, yeah. And I turned around and said, well, he has. So yeah. But I think with children, it's about letting them make their mistakes and then just saying, well, what might be a better way to do that next time? Let's find some better ways when the situations calm down. Obviously not when they're up here, but
Yeah.
And you
But that self-belief that you can do stuff is so important when you're young, isn't it?
Yeah,
To
and also
just,
the fact that you might have done something unkind or sworn or whatever, blah, 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 but also understanding that that is not going to mark your card forever. I'm going to learn from this and I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to say things differently. I'm going to behave differently.
yeah, I can
And that for me
change
is about
something.
resilience, that is about just stopping and looking back to make sure that when people talk about resilience as being bouncing back. Well, for me, it's about bouncing forward. It's about actually not doing what I did last time because it really didn't work.
Yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, I mean, we've mentioned a lot of the typical phrases that come up when we think of resilience. We talked about, yeah, bouncing back quickly or being able to withstand huge pressure or just keep taking on more and more. Or, in some cases, like some people, I've heard and seen some people define it as less, in quotes, sensitive, for lack of a better word. but they just kind of eventually realize, I think, that resilience needs to be more than that. But it's difficult, isn't it? Like you say, it's such an individual journey, whether you're
Mm.
a kid or an
And
adult, whether you're,
some people don't want to change, Laura.
yeah.
You know, I've worked with some leaders and they're like, well, it's how I am. And I was like, but it doesn't have to be who you are moving forward. But it takes time and it takes energy to actually really hold that mirror up to yourself and think, okay, so what am I going to do differently? People say, oh, I haven't got time to do that. Well, then fair enough. That's your choice.
And it is a choice.
Absolutely. And
Mm,
that's your choice. But I know it's not. You can do something about it. And that's what
yeah.
most of my work is with clients in all shapes and forms.
Every time I speak to a coach of any sort, that typically is the first thing that a lot of us in the profession work with on our clients is do you realize how much control you've got over this thing?
Yeah.
Do you realize how many decisions you could make?
And I always say, start small, try something really small, but just keep doing it because that will bring that picks up the momentum of something.
Step.
And the thing with resilience as well is it ebbs and flows. When I talk with clients, I talk about sometimes your window of resilience is wide open. And no matter, we've all had periods in our life where we surprise ourselves and think, oh, actually, so really note what is going on. What was the run up to it? Who's around you? What the environment is? Because these things don't often happen just by chance. There are often some conditions that you can replicate for something else. And then there are times when our window of resilience or our turbulence, whatever you want to call it, is firmly shut. And it's like, right, I can't, that's it, I'm done.
Friday,
And
five
it's
o'clock.
what can I do just to get that window open a little bit?
Cut
We've had,
off.
as a family, we've had quite a quite a tricky 18 months, really. Sort of, my dad sadly died September 23, and then my mum moved into a care home. And actually, there are just some things where I've just said, actually, I'm just not doing that. I'm not putting myself through that because it's not actually going to do me any good. And it's not about avoidance, or there are some things which actually I don't need to do. So I'm not doing them. And I think before I started all this work around resilience, I would have pushed through and then I would have come out the other side and felt absolutely wretched.
And it's towards the achievement of goals as well. I mean, my wife and I have had a tough year, but not because we've had any losses or anything like that. It's simply because we've had priorities. The podcast launch was obviously one of my biggest focuses
Mm.
at the back half of this year. And on top of that, my wife was finishing a master's degree, and we've got a 2.5-year-old in the house. So, you know, so the word no has been quite present in this house this year because we simply just said, you know what, our resilience needs to be put towards the achievement of what we're aiming for.
Okay. Yeah,
And
absolutely. And
it's
I always think when you say no, what are you saying yes to? Maybe you just don't know at the time, but you will be saying yes to other things.
you've said, and I quote,
Oh,
colleagues often told me, I have a quote.
oh dear, that's a bit of a worry.
I know. Colleagues often told me I was a good leader, but I didn't really understand what they meant. I was just doing and saying what felt right for me, sometimes to the detriment of my health and sanity. I resonated quite strongly with that. But I did exactly what you did, which was what I think and feel is right for me. And what I thought was right for me was to work myself into the ground, to surround my life with my job and make that my identity, which was my biggest mistake,
Yeah.
and serve everyone else to the eventual exclusion of my own needs. I figured out that what I was trying to do was make other people proud of me.
Mm.
And I'm just wondering if you've reflected on the stuff we talked about earlier and figured out what it was you were trying to achieve.
Yeah, and I've done a lot of thinking around that. So I was someone who I wouldn't say I struggled at school, but I wasn't in the top sets or anything like that. I had to work really, really hard to get qualifications. I'm certainly, I think I'm mildly dyslexic, but I've got strategies in place for that now. There was a big thing through my life about what my dad would think. And I probably only realised that my dad was, you know, he's proud of all his daughters, but he would say to me, "Oh, I've told the old boys at the Probers Club that you're now an Ofsted inspector and all of this lot." And not that I ever felt pressured by that, but I was always worried about what he would think. And when I resigned, he was the person I was most worried about telling me, but he was the person who was most overjoyed because he said, "I can just see what this is doing to you." So hindsight is a wonderful thing, isn't it, Laura?
Oh,
We can
yes.
look back and we can say, why on earth did I do that? Why on earth did I do that? But I think I was driven to prove myself. I don't know. Sometimes not to myself, but just to everybody around me, but especially my dad.
That was my moment of clarity. I didn't realize it at the time, but I had been working all these years and trying to do all the things that I did to make other people proud of me because I wasn't the
Mm.
typical academic kind of kid. I didn't go to university. I just went straight into the world of work. And I think the change really started 2 or 3 weeks after I'd been made redundant from my last full-time job. They offered me a fixed-term contract for 12 months. And I remember I got off the phone and looked at my wife and she said, "Your all the colour's gone out of your face." You have gone white as a sheet. Like it's what on
Yeah.
earth? So I told her what the phone call was about and she went, "Don't take it."
Mm.
At which point I'd already made a decision to start freelancing and done this
That
stuff.
is really interesting, isn't it? Because it's like I know when I first left headship, I got, "Oh, Jacqui, could you just take this school on just for a term? It's in trouble and everything." And your own ego can get in the way. It's like, "Oh,
Mm.
they really want me." Well, I'm sure they probably asked about 15 other people before they got to me, which my husband pointed out to me, which thank you. I thanked him for greatly. You were probably number 16 on the list. I was like, "Oh, cheers." But also reflecting back, I think the way I threw myself into my work also enabled me to not really think about some other rubbish that was going on in my life.
Like an escape.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
actually, when you are in a school with 600 pupils and whatever, and you don't think about anything else. You go in and yeah, and to a degree, you're going in is, I'm not going to say acting, because I always felt I was very authentic. But actually, I would always go in very upbeat. That is something that really drains your resilience, is when you are not being authentic, when you're pretending to be something that you're not. And you can keep that up for a while, but it's not sustainable. When I sat there at my desk in that Marshall, I thought, actually, I feel really, really ill. I am really
Mm.
ill. I can't even drive home because it's just not sustainable.
That kind of leads on to my next question, really, was the education sector, as we've said already, is just one example of where it's common for certain types of staff to be burned out, overworked, to get into patterns that they can't get out of. What is it that you think needs to change in terms of resilience so that this is not commonplace in these professions anymore?
Oh, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? I think what happens in schools is people rise up through the ranks, often quite quickly, and as I understand it, even quicker now, because the tail end of experienced schools, like people, in their 50s and 60s, like myself, are throwing the towel in possibly earlier than they would have liked to have done. And I think the thing around leadership is there's a real focus on leadership development around systems and processes and models of leadership. And there's not very much energy put into actually really understanding who you are as a leader and finding your own way. As a resilient leaders consultant, when we talk about that, we talk about two elements. We talk about the element of awareness and around leadership presence. By leadership presence, I don't mean that sort of, that charismatic leader who is full of confidence. It's like, as a leader, what happens when you're not in the room? what we were talking about earlier about actually, would people say, if you weren't there, Laura, okay, so we've got a bit of a crisis coming up, what would Laura do? So I don't think there's enough focus on that side of leadership. I think we are seeing a better balance, but people think that that's all a bit pink and fluffy. But actually, if you have not got self-awareness, I believe that you are only going to hit a certain point as a leader.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
as an educator, I mean, it's, as a
absolutely.
trainer myself, there really is only so far that I
Yeah.
could take any class of apprentices, of any ILM learners, of any other kind of training that I do, if I didn't have the level of self-awareness to know how I get the message across to somebody in a
Mm,
way that's engaging, that they understand, that they can take away and will actually think about and try and apply. Because for me, it's like, yes, okay, a lot of it is models and theories, and that's the bit
mhm.
you pass assessments on.
Yeah.
But I need you to get more than that out of it, because that piece of paper means nothing unless you can start looking at what this looks like for you.
Yeah, exactly. That actually is the key, isn't it? Anybody in any leadership role, and I believe we all lead ourselves in lots of different ways. We don't have to have leader in our title to be a leader, but it's about really understanding how you need to be, what you need to say and do to become the type of leader that gets the very best from other people, but whilst it all aligning with, with you. I mean, there are lots of things that made me throw the towel in, but there was one thing I really reflect upon, and that was when I was instructed to do something that I really, really disagreed with. It was around charging some of our really low income families who I knew really well for like breakfast club because they didn't get free school meals because they were just on that next tier up. This has all changed considerably now, but and so I used to let some of these families into breakfast club. Now, when I say breakfast club, it wasn't smashed avocado on toast or anything like that. It was like bowl of Rice Krispies and a piece of unpleasant white bread from Asda made as toast. And I was instructed to charge these families, and I refused. And that made me realize that actually one of my values is kindness. And I could not think rationally around this thing because, as far as I'm concerned, it was just a really unkind thing to do. It was costing the school next to nothing. It was about 8 children, 20p a day, 5 days a week. It's not a lot of money. And I think and as a leader, it's not until one of your core values is challenged that you actually realize that it's one of your values. And sometimes, I'm not saying that everyone should just throw the towel in if their values don't align with their organization as their business, because sometimes you can find a way to compromise and to actually level it with yourself. But I just couldn't with that. It just felt so unkind and totally unnecessary. And for me, that sits within that element of leadership presence, about being really true to yourself.
Yeah.
And we all know, don't we? We've all, I'm sure and probably all the people that are listening to this as leaders, is you have all experienced a time when you have done or said something and it's just made you feel seriously uncomfortable. And you've thought, that's not actually who I am.
Yeah. Sometimes we have to have something brought to our attention through a hard experience to realize how much it matters.
Mm.
One of my core things, I don't know if it was necessarily a value, but it's always been a thing, was just the acknowledgement of humanity in the business. That while we were built to be the most efficient, the most effective, the most productive, achieve the most sales, it was all about turnover, everything was about figures and data. In the center of all of that was 20 to
People,
60 staff, people,
exactly.
human
Oh, I'd say
beings.
acknowledging others is a value. And I always think values are like, if someone cut me open, hope they don't, they should run through you like a stick of rock. They're at the, and actually, you can't really hide your values because your values come through in your behavior. And when there is turbulence, and you're saying and doing things which don't sit well with you, then other people might not know, but you know at your core, and that's very uncomfortable. But you have to have quite a heightened sense of self-awareness around that. And
Yeah.
some of
And
the
I,
leaders I work with don't have that yet.
yeah. Unfortunately, working in a company like that eventually does have an impact on you.
Yeah, of
And there
course.
are points where you do start to see people as numbers, and there are times where you forget that there's a human being behind the person you're talking to. Yeah, okay, there needs to be a balance between business needs, your needs, staff needs.
Mm,
But in the same breath, it's when you just start to put not wanting to go into a conversation and getting a battering from your manager first, the sacrifices that you then make without really thinking about it
mm.
to the staff
And
that are
then I think
behind you.
if the frequency of that increases, like if you do it once, it's like, yeah. But if the frequency of that becomes more intense, then actually that then creates that turbulence inside of you, which it might just be pressure, but it might go from pressure to stress to overwhelm. If you don't find a way of behaving differently and saying and doing things in a different way, then it will just get more and more intense,
Yeah.
and it
And a
won't go away.
combination of realizing that that could increase. Thankfully, it hadn't yet. But also how strongly I wanted to stick with my sort of morals and ethics around running a business and how incompatible that was just made me go, not just this company, but this industry. I can't stay here anymore. This is enough. I'm done, you know.
Yeah, and that was me. I was like, I'm not going to do this anymore because I'm going to turn it into one of those old cynical head teachers that I used to look at when I was young and enthusiastic, and I don't want to be like that.
I didn't want to drop the leader I was to become the manager I didn't want to be.
No, no, I agree with you.
What's your purpose now?
My purpose now is, well, my purpose is twofold. My first purpose is all about me, to live, to enjoy, to seek out adventure, to be curious about things. My first purpose is for myself and to live life and not just exist. My second purpose is to show leaders, teams, who are my clients, that actually you can be in a job that you love, which makes unrealistic demands on you, and you can manage yourself and stay in the job. You don't have to quit. There are things you can do before you get to that stage. And if you've tried those things out and you still want to quit, fair enough. And I love working with people to find a different way of being and doing, often in jobs that people absolutely love. I loved my job. I loved it too much, really. And if I had my time again, I would do things very, very differently.
What's the one thing you would change if you were starting again tomorrow?
The first thing I would do is I would not sacrifice myself to serve other people. I wouldn't do that. I would find a greater balance with that.
I think I was lucky really because I didn't do that too much. I understood perfectly well that I can't do other people's jobs for them because a kitchen takes 20 people. So so they had to learn to do it themselves. But I think I kept finding stuff to do.
You set that expectation, but also other people who admired me as a leader, not everybody admired, would mirror my behavior because they thought that's what it was all about.
You have to break the cycle of the
Yeah,
person before you.
absolutely.
Jacqui, you bring so much experience and knowledge to your role, and I know how much time and effort you've dedicated to working on yourself and doing what you do now and setting up your business. It was also interesting to hear where the 43 in Leadership 43 came from because I didn't know that.
There you go. Every day's a school day.
Indeed. You've built yourself into an amazing support for leaders everywhere, not just in education. So if someone wants to find out more about what you do or connect with you, where can they go?
Go to LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, Jacqui Frost, Jacqui, Leadership 43. I am on Facebook, but I'm a bit rubbish there. And I am on Instagram, but I'm a bit rubbish there as well. LinkedIn is my go-to place.
LinkedIn is the link I will post then.
Marvelous.
No problem. I did say this to you before we started today's conversation, but I've always found you fascinating to talk to. I think you have an amazing storytelling ability, which is a quality I admire in people when I see it. But I think you have a particular way of just being able to explain what happened in a way that really resonates with other people. But you also have a huge wealth of knowledge and experience that would benefit any leader. So your journey with resilience was absolutely one I felt needed sharing. So the podcast was the perfect time to do that. And I'm so glad we did. It's been a really great conversation. I hope you've enjoyed your time on the Leaders
Yes, I
Podcast.
have. I can't believe it's gone very, very quickly. But like you said, it's easy to talk about something, isn't it, you feel quite passionate about? Well, not quite. I am passionate about.
It's been an insightful and empowering conversation. Thank you so much for being here. I
Well,
appreciate it.
thank you for having me, Laura. It's been lovely.
Until next time, everyone.